in screen share, I can help you with the chat as well.
Sweet. Thanks, Cam. For those of you that don't know Cam, Cameron Almond is one of the early learning partners. She works with us quite a bit. And she's done a lot around personalized learning. She helps out with standards-based grading. So a lot of the grading pieces she's really familiar with, even though we kind of do that from a K2 lens together. So, but she's one of my partners in crime. Marty's also on here. So at certain points, you may hear him chime in as well. So, as well as Beth, as we go through. So today, we're going to talk about some of the strategies that some of our teachers have actually used as they have implemented mastery grading in their classrooms. So like I said, two of the teachers probably will not be able to join us today just because of sickness and life. And that is just how it rolls, and we're okay. We'll continue to be flexible. But I do have a lot of their resources that we'll share with you today. There are tons and tons of links and different things embedded within this presentation today that might be beneficial at some point to you if mastery grading is something that you really do want to explore. So, so I encourage you to, if you click on that link, add it to your drive. We have a reflection document we're going to look at today a little bit, and that has the link to the slides as well. So I tried to make sure you were doubly covered just because there's a lot in here that some of our teachers have shared. Just to kind of put this at the forefront, this is our framework for teaching and learning. And as we think about where mastery grading really falls, just like last time, we're looking at those grades as a form of data, and we want to be as equitable with those grading practices as possible, just so we better serve our students. We want grades that clearly communicate mastery of content so that we can provide the right type of instruction for our students. And so just to kind of introduce who's going to be, or who was supposed to be on the call today, I'm Ashley McCormick, and I am the Director of Personalized Digital Instruction. Jessica Gillespie Johnson was going to be with us today, but she is sick, unfortunately. Jessica has been immersed in this work for several years. She was a middle school teacher. She has recently left the classroom and served in an instructional facilitator role, as well as an instructional AP. But she has worked from the teacher side of this, and she's worked with teachers within her building to help implement. So she has different perspectives, and she has shared a ton of her research and resources today. I'll let Beth Krivsky. Beth, if you want to unmute your mic and tell us a little bit about yourself and a little bit about why you have embarked down this road of mastery grading. Because you've been in this work for quite a while as well, too.
Yes, I've actually asked us to just share the beginning of our journey and why we're here. And really, for me, it's a quick trip back in history to when I started teaching as a lateral entry teacher. And having not had all the courses yet, I found myself having to teach grading, as we all do. And I found myself wondering, you know, how do I get
Beth?
What do I
I think we're having a hard time hearing you. I think a couple people have pointed to their ears, and I'm having a hard time as well. I was trying to make sure my volume was all the way up, and it wasn't just my computer. So Beth, while you're working on that, I'm going to talk about the next teacher. And then you just interrupt me when you're ready. It's one of the other teachers who has experienced some difficulties with just the ice and the weather. Stephanie Merritz is a third grade teacher out at Caleb's Creek who has done some of this work around mastery grading at the elementary school level. she works really closely with another teacher at the school, Jana Hintz, and they're kind of partners in crime when it comes to this. But Stephanie has lost power, therefore internet and Zoom will not work. And so we have a lot of her resources today that we'll kind of look at and talk through. But she's someone at the elementary school level that has done this for a couple years now and seen some great success with her students. So even though we won't hear her voice, we'll see some of her resources that she's used today. I don't know if you got your sound fixed or not, Beth. Not yet. Might have to go out and come back in. All right. So Beth, we'll figure it out. We'll get your sound working. But while we're waiting for that, I do want to keep going just because I want to be respectful of y'all's time today too. So Beth, if you get your sound working, just interrupt me. I'm good with that. I taught middle school. So the last time we were together, we really tried to dive in this idea of what should be a grade. And we looked at several different practices that all teachers at some point, I would wager, at least used one of those influences in their grades that didn't particularly speak to the idea of mastery. Even though this is just our word cloud from last time, you can see that when we talk about what a grade should be, you see some of those words that pop up. And one of the largest in that word cloud is mastery. And so when we think about what a grade should communicate, we're really looking at that idea of mastery of content standards. And so you'll see that throughout here, reflection of knowledge and measurement, proficiency. There's some other words in there as well, things we definitely want to consider like participation and effort, but really thinking about how we report some of those things separate from some of our academic evidences that we collect. And so that's where we really started last time, very broad conversation and discussion just around what should a grade be and what that kind of looks like in practice. And so we've started very high level last time and really thinking through this lens of some of our core values, especially that equity lens. And we really want to think about how we can start transitioning some of these practices that may not be equitable for all of our students and really implementing some of those practices that are more equitable and that provide us the information to provide targeted instruction for our students so that we can address either those gaps or those strengths, either way. And one of the ways that we do that is through the use of mastery-based grading. And so we dove into a little bit of those practices last time, but we're going to look through the teacher lens this time and really think about how some of these teachers, what are things they did in the classroom to make this transition successful for them. And I'm sure they will attest to the fact that this is very much a journey and they continue to make tweaks throughout this whole process because they continue to learn. So I see you pop up, Beth. Did you get your sound working? Still not working?
Yes, tell me, can you hear me? Okay.
I can hear you.
Okay.
Introduce yourself, Beth. I saw you up there. Go ahead.
So I am Beth Krivsky, and just to jump back to that introductory slide, Ashley asked us to share where we started our journey. For me, it was when I started as a lateral entry teacher, and the one thing I hadn't thought through was how am I going to grade? So I began to ask people, you know, how do you grade? I remember asking a lot of questions like, how many points should I give for this? How many points should I give for that? And, you know, it's 5 here, 10 there. Do I curve? No, yes. Everybody had their own unique grading practices, which was very quick for me to understand that grades were not clear from one class to the next, from teacher to teacher. And that bothered me, especially as I had high school kids, you know, thinking, okay, so wow, this could really impact, you know, admission to colleges. So just recognizing the just differences and lack of clear meaning for what a grade really should be or how it should be determined really pushed me in that direction. The instructional facilitator was Rachel Sanchez at the time, where the school I was at, and she introduced me to a book, A Repair Kit for Grading by Ken O'Connor. It was really more grade reform was the term that she used, was let's rethink our grade. You know, what does it mean? And so from that point on, then she introduced me to Brittany Guy, who introduced me to personalized learning, who that introduced me then to Ashley, of course, when all that got started. But it's all very closely related. And that whole, what does this grade mean thing as an early teacher got me here.
Yeah, and so Beth has really been doing some of this work for quite a few years now. I mean, I remember when she started out and we were working with her at Mineral Springs Middle School, and then kind of following her throughout her career. And so she's been in this for a while and made several tweaks. And so she'll share some of the things that she's learned and done throughout this whole process. And she is really one of our go-to teachers when we talk about it, because she's done it in all different kinds of schools with different populations, the whole nine. So I'm excited that she's with us today. As we go through here, we're going to share some of the strategies that this small group of teachers have used in their classroom to make this successful, and things that they want to point out as important in this journey. And so as we go through, I want to give you a minute. We're going to start with some reflecting. And so what I have is I'm getting ready to throw a link in the chat for you. And we're going to stop periodically throughout this session to give you think time. Because that's the thing with grading, is it can be very, very heavy. And so as we share some of these strategies and we share some of these resources and things like that, after each section, we're going to pause and give you some processing time, some time to take some notes, next steps, jot down things you liked, questions you might still have, but we want to give you some processing time. Talk about it in the classroom. It's important for learning. You need that time to process. So in just a moment, I'm going to throw a link in the chat, and I'm going to give you 3 to 4 minutes. And some of the strategies that our teachers are sharing today are laid out in here. There's a self-reflection piece to this. So I want you to think about each one of these strategies: alignment to standards, communication, mindset, reteaching, and spiraling. Think about these different strategies and just kind of rate yourself. You can either highlight, you can put an X, whatever works for you in your note-taking scheme. And then any kind of notes you might want to take, any ideas, anything you kind of want to jot down before we get started. And then, like I said, after each section, we're going to take a pause and a break, and you can kind of jot down any notes, like, yes, I'm on the right track, or I might need to tweak this, or just to give you some of that processing opportunity. So let me see if I can get over here and throw this link. This is where all of this, like, multiple screens becomes real fun. All right, so I threw that link in the chat for you. I'm going to share my screen again and start the timer. I'm going to give you about 3 minutes just to kind of go through there. When you click on that link, it should force you to make a copy, which means that document is going to live in your drive. So this is your notes, your tangible. No one's going to see it but you. So mark it up however you feel necessary to facilitate your learning. So I'm going to go ahead and start that timer. and let you have some time just to think through some of those strategies. While I do that, some of you have asked about last week's session. I'm going to try to go in and find that recording and throw that link in there for some of you that have asked.
Julie and Kim, I also went ahead and emailed it to you, so you have it. Ashley, we have the question in the chat. Do you want us to answer for this year or for a normal year?
Normal.
Yeah, so just think about a normal school year, what you do. All right, so we're going to use that document throughout today's session. So hold on to it. If you didn't get it, we can throw that link back out there. Cam can copy it and throw it back out there for you if you didn't get it. But we're going to use that throughout today's presentation to give you some processing opportunities and time to take notes. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to jump in. We're going to talk about several different strategies, which you saw in that document today. So as we go through each one of these, either myself or Beth are going to talk through some of just the importance of and the why behind those strategies are so important to mastery and that mastery mindset. And so that first one that we're going to look at, I know this is something that we hammer home. We talk about it all the time, even outside of this idea of mastery, but the importance of our alignment to standards. And in a mastery system, it becomes even more important because we do not want this gotcha situation when we say, hey, this is the standard and this is the learning target. And then this is how I'm going to assess you. And those two things don't mesh or align. We don't want those gotcha situations for our students. And so as we go through and we think about mastery and just learning in general, we want very clear expectations for our students. And we want those standards to guide that work. And so I'll let Beth kind of share some of her thoughts and ideas around why that alignment is so important.
Yeah, and so first I just want to comment on why I said to use your whatever normal means anymore for that reflection sheet. Because for me, when I look back at that, it's really been about 8 years since I began thinking like this. There's been a, like a shoots and ladder game, like get to a certain point and then, something happens, reflection, different type of students, you go back. So I think it's a journey of reflection, rethinking, and progress all the time. But the one thing that doesn't change, I think, in any of our educational mindsets is that we need to begin with the end in mind. So if you look at the goal here at the end of the timeline, the goal is successful learning, which really is how we can define mastery. And it's so critical that we identify students that are successfully learning, so that we know what the next step is, so we can communicate to them, so they know where they're at, so we know where they're at, so that we are honestly, accurately giving meaningful feedback. And we talk about MTSS too. If we don't have meaningful grades, what is it we're using to identify their learning? So in order to get to that successful learning, we have to go back a step in the timeline. We have to have meaningful measurements of skills, which really is a definition of assessment. We use that term assessment all the time, but we really could replace that with the terms meaningful measurement, because we're measuring their learning when we're assessing. So this is also our evidence. So really using that word evidence almost as a replacement for grades would be a very valid thing to do, because and at the Virtual Academy, we had begun using evidence of learning as our grades in a mastery mindset. So that's what we want to communicate mastery. We have to have some genuine evidence. To get to the evidence though, we have to have truly and quality aligned instruction, because that's what's driving our learning. And if we're doing things in our class that they are cool and fun and engaging, but they're not aligned to our learning targets, then we're going to have struggle reaching that mastery point. So we need those clear targets to address those goals and verbs. That's basically our best practices. And then going back to that one step, it's kind of where we've been at last week and this week, is we've got to establish a mastery mindset. What is mastery? What are we talking about? You're going to hear a lot of fantastic strategies and tools today. But before that really comes an understanding that our grades have to mean something. And so we might have to rethink, like we always doing, and establish some new definitions, new norms. What does it mean? So I think, this kind of summarizes the whole journey that you may be starting now, but the end point is every time a kid successfully learns, but it's continually going to be something that you're working on and changing and progressing.
And so I like the idea that Beth brought up, really looking at those verbs that are in your standards, and really letting that drive how we design instruction and what those assessments look like. Oftentimes we look at those verbs and it'll say something like differentiate or identify. And when we look at what we're asking students to do as that product of learning, there's a mismatch there. And so really letting those standards drive home what that mastery should look like, and really making sure there's that tight alignment between that product of learning, whatever it is, whether it's a quiz, like a traditional multiple choice quiz, a performance assessment of some type, some kind of open-ended constructed response, whatever it is, that those two things align is really important, because we're telling the kids that's how we're going to assess them. And like I said at the beginning, we don't want that gotcha scenario. Go ahead, Beth.
I was just going to interject with that. A class I took working on my master's degree was about measurement, evaluation, assessment. And the one phrase I will never forget was teach like you're going to assess. So if you're going to assess and you want the student to be able to understand a pie chart in the assessment, but you have never taught it except for in words, then you haven't properly taught them the way that you're going to assess. So that's been really meaningful to me, is to make sure I'm teaching like I'm assessing. So.
Yeah, and like I said, in education, we talk about alignment to standards all the time in different contexts, right? But it really is foundational to this whole transition to mastery grading. And we have lots of resources out there, your curriculum coaches and content coaches, instructional facilitators and APIs. They are all great resources to help facilitate that work. Your peers that have been teaching and know those content standards inside and out. So there are people you can lean on to help with that process. So don't be afraid. I know when I was first starting, I was like, I don't even know what this means. So leaning on that PLT and those instructional leaders is really important as you begin to kind of look at that alignment, and getting feedback is really important. So we're gonna stop and pause and reflect in just a moment, but I want to pair this a little bit with this idea of communication. And communication is key in this whole process for a lot of reasons. And so I often talk about the idea, like I said, full transparency, I taught middle school. And so that means kids have been in school quite a while. Even when I taught 6th grade, they've been in school quite a while. They learn this game of school. And so if you're going to change the game on them, we need to be able to communicate that and the purpose of that. And not just with students, we need to communicate with all of our stakeholders. And so one of those stakeholders, oftentimes that when I first got really gung-ho, it was my administration that brought the idea of mastery grading to me when we made this whole transition. So I didn't have to seek that out. But I know that that's something that Beth, as she did her research, she was one that had to go in and kind of advocate and talk with her administration about the why behind. But administration is key. They need to understand what's happening in your classroom and that assessment and grading and how you're doing that. And some leaders have a firm understanding of what mastery-based grading is, and some don't. And so being able to articulate your why and the research that supports it is really important. And so one of the resources we've put in here for you all, and some of you have asked about this was part of the feedback last time, was kind of like a cheat sheet. And so that document that's linked in there, this is a working and living document. So that means it will be continuously updated. But it's one of those documents that has lots and lots around grade reform and this idea of equitable grading practices and mastery grading. And so this is something, as you kind of dip your toes in or you're interested in mastery grading, I really encourage you to do your research, to go through and to look at not what Ashley says or what just Beth says, but look at what some other people and leading researchers in the field are saying as well. And so as you work through there, if you have administration, you have parents even, or students that have questions, we wanted to provide you with some resources there to help, because no one might recognize my name, but they may recognize Fisher and Fry or Marzano or some of those individuals that have also been in this work. But getting your administration on board and kind of articulating your why and your vision for what mastery grading is really important. Some of the others, and this is Jessica Gillespie Johnson did a great job in the classroom of communicating to parents and students. She spent, and I can attest to this, we've used her resources multiple times. But she would tell you, and I'm sure Beth can too, that it takes quite a bit of articulation to parents and to students for them to understand, because this is a shift in the way that grading has been done. And so some of the things that Jessica would have handouts for her parents and students, but it was also this continued conversation. And so one of the really powerful pieces that she shared was this whole shift in grading. And as we shift from some of the more traditional practices to more of these standards aligned, standards based, or mastery based, some of those shifts. And so I always loved this. Her parents and her students have also commented on this in surveys that she's given. It kind of talks through some of those, that we want to take this from, we're leaving out some of those behaviors and the focus becomes on learning. It's not about the quantity of grades, but about the quality of grades. It's not about the journey to learning, but the destination and what you learned at the end of this process. And so she has quite a few resources that she uses with her parents and students. She gives this to parents and students at the beginning of the year. So her explanation and her why behind mastery grading, but also she wholeheartedly believes in this idea of retesting and retaking. And so she had some guidelines out there and the communication up front about what those guidelines would be, that this is not something you just take for granted, but there is an accountability piece. If you're going to retake and redo that work, we're going to put that work and that onus back on you. And so she has a ton of great resources, like I said, out there that she has used. And then she had parents and students, after quite a bit of articulation and talking through what this really meant in her classroom and the why behind it, she had students and parents sign an acknowledgement. And what I love is that in the student part of this, the student acknowledges that this is like, my learning is part of my responsibility in the classroom. And she could always refer back to that as students, like if they wanted to retake and redo without putting in the work, she would say, hey, but you signed a contract at the beginning of the year that said you would be willing to do, and so she has quite a bit out there. A lot of the student and the parents is very similar. But you'll see when she talks about that student, she said it has to be continuous conversation in the classroom. It's a lot of teachers will introduce the syllabus and talk about the grading practices at the beginning. And then it isn't as much of a conversation as you continue through. But she talks about the idea of that it really has to be consistent and it has to be a part of the culture. And I think Beth's going to speak to that a little bit in just a minute as well. But those are some of the resources that she has out there. Yes, so Lori, all of this is linked in the slide deck, and we have shared it multiple times, so people have borrowed. That's what we do in education quite often. We borrow each other's stuff all the time. So, yep, all those links are there. But communication is a big part of this. Like I said, parents understand the way that they were graded, and so they assume that process is going to continue. Students the same way. Like they've been graded very similarly throughout their schools, throughout this whole process. And so when you start changing the game, they become a little antsy. And so that communication piece is very key to the success of this. Beth, anything you want to add to the communication?
It probably comes in on that mindset slide. We'll probably add in at that point.
So what I want to do, so like I said, communication with all those stakeholders is important. And we've talked about alignment to standards as well. I want to give you a couple minutes. If you want to click on some of those links, Cam, will you throw Cam's throwing the links in the chat if you want to just click on them from the chat as well. But I want to give you a couple minutes to go back to your reflection document, take any kind of notes that you would like to take, add links, questions you might have, things like that. But I want to give you some processing time because we've talked about alignment to standards and the importance there. And we've also talked about that communication piece. So I'm going to set a 2-minute timer on my phone and give you a couple minutes to just decompress and process. So I'm going to stop talking.
And Ashley, when we come back, Kim had the question of, does this work with lower grades as well?
Sweet, I'll address that in 1 minute, 37 seconds. All right. So as far as lower grades go, our K2 students are already graded under a standards-based system, which builds off of this idea of mastery. It actually takes it a step further because they don't average grades. They've also transitioned to a 1 to 4 scale, which research talks about. It's funny, research. I just sent Marty some of this because he was talking about it earlier. A 1 to 4 scale, which doesn't have as big of a skewing effect as like a 100-point scale. So they have taken some of these ideas and really, K2 really goes above and beyond with the implementation of standards-based and changing that grading scale and things like that. Even in 3-5, these things definitely work. And we have multiple elementary school teachers that have implemented some of these mastery-based practices in their classrooms. Stephanie's one of them, but we have others across the district that have also done things like retakes and redos and things like that with their 3-5 students. And I actually think some of them have talked about the idea that sometimes with younger students, the mindset shift is a little easier than at maybe the secondary level for some of them to kind of shift that thinking around what a grade should be and things like that. Especially as they transition from standards-based to traditional, they're used to some of this idea of retaking and reassessing until mastery. So that kind of paves the way for some of these. But I definitely think, well, we have teachers at the 3-5 level that have definitely done this and implemented it in the classroom in different ways. So that's a great question. All right, the whole communication piece lends itself very well to mindset. And so as you communicate the purpose for your grades and the why behind how you grade, part of what should be in that communication is this whole shift around mindset. And so I know Beth has done some work. Well, all of us that have implemented it have had to do some work around mindset. And so Beth, I'll let you take it.
Okay. And I did just see a quick screenshot of someone's comment about how do you do this with ESL students. There's a huge question too, how do you do this with EC students? So I think those are great conversations, and I know Ashley is planning on having some training with that in the new year.
Yep.
But that's going to play in, and I hope maybe I'll have a chance to tie in some of my thinking there, because I think it's very applicable for all learners. And I'm trying to train myself to say learner, not student. But as you can see, I put students at the top here. So students need to hear and know this. So if we go back to that timeline slide that I was mentioning, that mindset is that number one piece, but it can't just be a teacher mindset. It's got to be something that we transform the thinking of education. We need educational reform. So it's got to be our change of thinking, parents' change of thinking, and students. And honestly, we have not trained them to have a mindset that is focused on learning. It's been very compliance, like, what do I need to do to get this many points kind of things. That's what we've trained our students to do. So students really need to hear and know what a grade means in your class. It needs to be a regular piece of the conversation. I actually try my hardest, but I fail, to not use the word grade, but to always reference, we're doing what we're doing to learn, not for the grade. And you really can transform your class to that. I've had students correct their classmates. We're not doing this for a grade, we're doing this to learn. So I'm like, you go, because that's the mindset we want to create in the classroom. It's about learning. And we have to be the ones in the class that are running that show, always talking about, we're doing this today to learn. We're doing this to prepare for the next level. We're doing this to learn. Also, we want students to hear and know that we work in class, we just said that's to learn, not for grades, points, or completion. There is a tendency for students, they want to get it done, they want to get something done, fill those blanks in, copy the whatever. And so we really want to change that mindset, teachers, parents, students, that we're not just doing things for points. And I always like to make the comparison, are the students doing things just to do them, or are we doing things to learn them? And so it's like, what's the goal here? That you got it done or that you learned it? Third thing that they really need to be hearing and knowing is that one purpose for learning is to be ready for the next level. And I tell my students, I say, when you get to ninth grade, they're not going to say, let's see now, you had a 72 last year, right? That's not what's going to matter. What's going to matter is, has that student really mastered that? And there's a video that's attached at the end, I think, that tells you the definition of mastery. Students need to know that content so well that they can not just recall it, but apply it to the next level. So these are goals. None of us are going to reach this, you know. These are all goals, but it does change our mindset, and little by little, baby steps, we can make some progress. And the fourth one I always say, I probably should have put at the top, was how the brain learns and grows. And these are things that as we norm them, they become a part of our routine, and they don't seem like such a chore, or like, oh my gosh, how am I gonna have time for that? I don't have time to do what I'm already doing. But making these norms and talking about those dendrites and how we learn and how a good night's sleep counts, and things like that. Here's 2 links. One is a little resource that I've used for trying to teach students. And the reason I'm not trying to focus on what I'm doing right now is because there's a lot of things I had done in building my mastery classroom that I've not been able to incorporate because I'm too new right now. But, that's the one. One of the articles is about being a neuro teacher. Well, my thing is, we want them to be neuro students and understand how they learn. Research actually supports that students that understand how they learn do better. And I could not find that article, but I'm going to keep looking. But just teaching that, even a little, I have a poster I just would hold up in class, and tell them every time you hear, even when you think you've mastered it and you keep hearing it, you're making greater and greater connections. And so, and I'm still working on implementing this, but this is something I really want to be a neuro teacher. I really want my students to know how they learn. So I think these are critical, and they do go right along with the communication piece, because if we're communicating these to our students, well, let's give that same information to parents on a repeated basis. If you're sending emails, those kind of things, and it helps us grow.
Go ahead.
Hey, Beth.
Yes.
Can you speak a little bit to how you do this while still following district mandated pacing guides and such?
I sure will. So,
Awesome.
And that is a struggle. Yes. So for science, and I understand science standards are different than other subjects. So I recognize that. but my starter statement will be, but for whatever our standards are, we must be assessing that in some way. And if we're assessing that in some way, then that is the piece we would use for our evidence of learning, for our grades. Now, if I'm going to be doing that piece there, then I need to be communicating to my student what it is that that grade means. So I just told my students the other day about how my categories are set up. One is activities of learning, one is evidences of learning. And yeah, it's a hard thing. They don't always get it. You mean you're not grading these? But ultimately, I'm not. And I don't lie to them about that. I tell them, these are activities for practice. And I turned to my students and I said, but boys and girls, if you don't ever do the learning activities, how are you going to do on the evidences of learning? And they know it. I'm not going to do very well. I'm not a homework person. I've never been a homework person. So I try to address what I need to in the class, which is important because then I have more accountability to making sure they're doing the learning. It is a much greater challenge right now for me. I'm going to be straight up and honest, knowing who's doing what. And it's like a different world, of course. But so I don't know if that helps a little bit, but starting off the beginning of the year, communicating and then talking to them, surveying them, learner profiles periodically, like how do you learn best? Or what do you think? I surveyed my students recently. I said, if you're not doing well, would you be willing to come for help? Communication about learning and trying to use learning and talk about learning all the time, I think I'm trying to help them flip their thinking to understand that we're not here just to get this done. But ninth grade science, and I told them this just yesterday. I said, when you get to ninth grade science, you are going to be so much happier and more successful if you have built the foundation based on this year. Now, to address your pacing guide, that is a challenge. I am not on my pacing guide right now. I'm behind. Our whole PLT is behind, but we're in a different world. But I think I'm learning how to hit the meat of the standard and the verb better. I'm learning how to weed out what I'm focused on. I get really attached to videos that are so cool, but I realize, I need to get rid of that one because I need to focus more on this one. Trying to do a lot more. I'm not a big, let's do vocabulary, Frayer model. I'm not big on that. I'm big on teaching vocabulary in context because I think that's where they're going to see it and hear it, but reinforcing it with Quizlet. So the pacing guide, I think it can be doable, but we have to really learn to evaluate what we're doing. I am behind now. And I'm trying, at some point in time, I guess I have to catch up. What that's going to mean is maybe the next unit, I'm going to cut out a little bit and try to hit exactly what it is, not all the cool biotechnology things that I want to do, because it's going to be hard for me. But I think sometimes as teachers, we have to focus on that. I definitely don't know all the answers to your question because that's a tough one.
Yeah,
that was honestly exactly what I wanted to come out of your mouth is you're behind and it's okay to be behind.
Yeah.
I'm behind Joel Leith, so
well
he's ahead of me.
Everybody's behind Joel Leith.
No, Joel's awesome.
Joel
he's very awesome.
Yeah, he's awesome.
Yeah, he is. But that brings us to, and we'll stop and reflect in just a moment, I promise. But that brings us, Mr. Wyatt, to kind of the next idea is one of the big tenets and like the foundational pieces to mastery grading is this flexibility of pace. And so then with pacing guides looming over us, how do we continue to reteach and spiral content, right? Because this whole conveyor belt of education, we know that that's not realistic for our kids. They don't all learn at the same time in the same way on the same day. Like, no, it doesn't work that way. But balancing the reteaching piece of it and the pacing guides and all of the other expectations, and now this whole virtual piece, it's a lot. And so that's one of the things, and we'll pause after this. That's one of the things that always comes up. How do I do this? Like, I don't have time. So how do I do it? And so I'm going to have Beth share some of the things that she does in the classroom that have made this kind of part of her norm. And like she said, sometimes we do better at this than others. Some years it's better than others. but then sharing some other strategies as well. So Beth, you want to jump in and share how you've kind of made this part of your class?
Yeah, and I think, first of all, it's very normal that all of us within a pacing guide world, when we dream of a different world for education, it's not there. But that word reteach is one that makes us all want to cringe, because we're like, I can't even teach what I'm supposed to teach. How am I supposed to reteach? When in the world do you want me to do that? And so if we have, but it's, you know, it's good, you know, all levels have to understand that. This is not an easy thing to do. It is a struggle for me. I feel like after hearing when Brittany was more in charge than Ashley, she always talked about spiraling, and I would hear it and I would go, yes, I'm going to spiral. But I didn't know how to make it happen until we became a digital world. I was at a Verizon school, and I realized, man, all I got to do is put a QR code up on the board, and when they come in, bam, they take a quizzes every day. And that was the beginning of when I really felt like I began to do some reteaching, because that gave us a chance in the middle of our evolution genetics unit to maybe do some questions on chemistry. But I've spiraled backwards in that capacity. But January 2021 is going to be a new year. So number one is my plan for 2021 is that I will start my day off with, if for those teachers are familiar with quizzes, I just discovered the live feature. Let the kids, I don't care at this point for spiraling right now for exactly what data. I don't have time to look at every piece of formative data, examine every child's levels all the time. But I'm going to start my class off with what I'm going to call my daily live 5 questions. They come in, we answer. And the live feature allows you to do it teacher paced. So one at a time, pop the question up. I can see by all the little funny names when the blink on that I know everyone has answered that question, and we will talk about that question. So that gives me a chance to pull up a whiteboard or something and talk through it. But I thought, okay, that's realistic. That's 5 questions, not 25, not 10, but 5 questions I could hit on some spiraling. And that, I think, is a piece of that brain research, that more and more exposures, the more and more memory we have built. So we've got to be doing that spiraling. Whiteboards and visuals, I've kind of held on to my old school some with, maybe it's a lack of tech skills, I don't know, but I like hold up my little whiteboard right here in front of the kids and draw pictures and ask them questions. And, you know, if I haven't gotten to anything else and it's like spur of the moment thought, grab that whiteboard and talk about it. So visuals, I think visuals are so key, but I don't always use them, but these are some goals I have. But I've used whiteboards in the classroom a lot. I think that's a great way to bring back, reteach, whatever you're doing. Collaborative breakouts, really what I'm talking about here is cooperative learning strategies. I have learned a lot about those. Implementing them has been a journey, like everything is for me, and trying to make it happen, and you know, all the things that we deal with in the classroom. I think that gives us a chance to allow students to talk. And once again, brain research tells us that talking about it is so important. So I think those talking and visuals, just little bits, are ways we can reteach. Doesn't mean we have to go back and start all over. Doesn't mean we'll never be able to do that. But to be able to hit on little pieces, main points that we know are takeaways they have to have. And then this last one's been easier for me to implement in some ways in this virtual environment, because our school has, the Virtual Academy has a support block every day from 2:55 on, and that students can show up at. So that's key, is pulling in a kid, and this addresses the EC kid for me. I have EC kids that are really struggling, as many, but to be able to get one-on-one with some of them who never do anything, and be able to hold up a whiteboard and draw pictures for them, and realize, oh my goodness. And a mom sat beside one kid one day, and we were like, he knows this. You know, he never would have passed a multiple choice or some test. But for me to sit there and talk with him with visuals one-on-one, I mean, I gave the kid the grade because he knew what we thought he probably knew nothing. So I think we have to look outside the box for our EC kids, and it is a challenge, but it's all these things have to be, we have to figure out ways to norm them. And that's probably where we need to have some conversations on what are ways, and let's start learning to norm these things in our class. And it's a challenge, but norming that EC one-on-one kind of help too, because EC really means nothing. It means as much as non-EC. we have EC kids that are high performing, we have EC kids that are struggling. So that would be, I think, my tip, because I was reflecting on how it's been a struggle for me, and it's only happening if it's something that I'm norming. So.
Yeah, and so someone actually brought up this next idea in the chat as well, but this idea of playlists and leveraging those. And there are ways that you can leverage playlists to help address maybe some gaps or to spiral content. Those differentiated playlists can really help to address some of that. And so even by looking at that playlist and starting it with the pre-assessment and letting that pre-assessment guide where students start. And so here's an example. This is 6th grade ELA. And so ELA is one of those subjects where standards are constantly being spiraled and applied in different ways with different text. And so multiple exposures is something that some of our ELA teachers are really familiar with. But this is one that was created, and it's a differentiated playlist. It's based off of their pre-assessment score. They may have to go through some kind of relearning activity or some extra practice. With this case, it's an iReady lesson on point of view. But if not, if they're already proficient, they understand point of view, they're going to skip a little bit down, and they're going to go through and start with a different point in this playlist. And so leveraging that kind of foundational structure that some of our students now, because of remote learning, they're so used to, could be very beneficial. And we could do a whole PD just on how to differentiate a playlist, because there are multiple ways. You could have different copies of playlists with different activities embedded. You could utilize pre-assessments, the idea of including things for enrichment or acceleration, because that's always a question. Well, if kids aren't always starting at the same spot, like, what if one kid gets done early? Awesome. Like, let's provide them with some enrichment or even some exposure to the next grade level standards, some acceleration. And so there are different ways that you can structure that, but building off of that playlist template or that playlist structure that we already have in place that kids are kind of used to by now, working through.
Ashley, can I just comment one more thing on that? I know we're probably running out of time, but the differentiated playlists, in my master's research, my research was about how students were engaged and achieved with a pathway. And one of my goals was, and have not implemented it in the class well, but for reteaching, it's a great way. If there's a pathway that they could choose and they don't choose, let's say, pathway B or activity B, and then they take their check that for understanding that does not show proficiency, then they had to, I've done this a little bit, not much, they had to go back to another path, A, B, or C, to complete that additional activity. So the idea was that if reteaching one way didn't work, finding a different way to reteach the second time. So I think that can be key on hitting what they might have missed. Maybe they just need to hear it a different way.
Yeah, and one of the other ways that I think lower grades teachers may be more comfortable with, because it's so ingrained in elementary school, is the idea of stations. So stations give you that flexibility to continue to cover content that needs to be covered. I can continue to move forward with my pacing guides, but one of my stations may be dedicated to spiraling or review, where students go back and they address a standard or a skill that they were not proficient in, and they can go back, and maybe you have digital resources built on Canvas or a playlist they could go back and reference. You don't have to recreate the wheel, use things you've already created, but you could pull some of those pieces and utilize them within the classroom to help reteach. Or even, I mean, there are all kinds of ways that you can do that, but I always try to remind, especially secondary teachers, that stations are a great way to build in some time to allow students to go back and relearn.
Ashley, if you were jumping up and down as much as I am with you saying that, you'd be having that baby right now. That's exactly right. Stations work for any grade level.
Yeah, and one of my favorite teachers to work with ever in life, she is like a big station person. She's always been a station person, but then she would make all the kids go to all the stations. She's like, they all need the same review. And then reluctantly one year she said, Ashley, I'm going to let them look at their data and they're going to choose. And she saw like this huge spike in her growth because students were really targeting the skills that she was like, okay, bye. She was so fun. You just have to know this teacher. She's very, she's like myself and very sarcastic and opinionated. So it was very interesting to have that
I love
conversation. But yeah, that's a great model. And if you have a lesson plan, you can take almost any lesson plan and rearrange it to incorporate some kind of station, or even starting whole class and then breaking into stations. You can do that in a virtual environment too. It just takes a little bit more tweaking to make it happen. And then I know we're running over, so just to kind of throw one other idea at you, this came from Atkins High School. They have a group of teachers that do these things called Throwback Thursdays or Flashback Fridays. And so they take part of a class period on a Thursday or a Friday, and they dedicate a certain amount of time to allow students to go back and relearn, whether it's whole class, if it's something the whole class is struggling with, or individually students have the opportunity to go back in and address different assignments, assessments that maybe they didn't meet mastery on. And so this was their way of dipping into that idea of flexibility of pace, setting aside one day a week in doing that, because of that, like the very real pressure of pacing guides. But they were like, okay, I can do one day. I can do a Throwback Thursday or a Flashback Friday and let kids do some of that. And so I thought that was a great way to kind of allow for some of that. That isn't quite as high stakes. So what I'm going to do is we have some things on retakes and redos that we can kind of share and talk through, but we are over our time by about 10 minutes. So for anyone who would like to stay and hear about retakes and redos a little bit, and we'll be quick, you can. I know that people have 1,001 things going on in life. So if you need to take your attendance and you have to take somebody to, I know somebody said they had to take a kid to Taekwondo. I totally get it. I did go ahead and put the attendance form in there as well. So you can take your attendance and you will not hurt my feelings or Beth's feelings if you have to log off. Like, not at all. We totally understand. Beth's kids are grown. My kid is young, but we both have them and we have lives and we know that there are 1,000 things. So, but we have one more big thing that we'll kind of share with you. And then if you guys have questions, you can always ask as well as we go through. So the attendance form is out there. If you have to go, like I said, no hard feelings. There's just one more thing we want to share with you all. There's actually a couple, but we'll stick to one because I feel like it's one that a lot of teachers ask about. And that's retakes and redos. It goes hand in hand with that relearning. So if you're going to reteach something, then I think it just goes hand in hand that you're going to allow students to demonstrate their new learning. So that whole process can seem very, very overwhelming, and just the management of it and the accountability piece for the students. I've seen it in the chat today already, like how is this addressing accountability, which is one of our core values from a district standpoint as well. And so we can talk a little bit about that. But like I said, if you need to jump off, please do so. Totally understand. I love this quote by Rick Wormley. Stephanie Merritt's, she's a third grade teacher out at Caleb's Creek. She actually, she added it. She had the opportunity to go, and I did too, so did Beth, and go and hear Rick and be a part of one of his seminars. He's so funny, so funny. But he says, relearning, redoing, retaking, and do-overs are integral to robust learning. And I totally agree. This, like the industrial model of education, does not work. We know that. It's not equitable for our students. And so to address some of that, allowing students to demonstrate their learning when after they've learned it, whether that's right on pace or whether that's a couple weeks after we've gone through the unit, if they're going to put in the time and effort to relearn it, you better believe I'm going to give them the opportunity to retake and redo something. And so these are just a couple kind of reminders when you think about retakes and redos. Beth,
yeah, go ahead and these are just things that I try to keep in mind. It's just that a random retake is not really effective. So sometimes we want to just, let them take it 2 or 3 times in a row. Sometimes we have to be careful that we're not measuring learning as well. And it just depends on the situation. But allowing time between retakes so that there is an opportunity to relearn is important. And it can be a whole class thing. We want to keep in mind that more learning activities need to be provided before second measurement. That's the same thing. And this is key to me, is if we value learning so much, then it can't be failure. Failure cannot be the endpoint. So if we're not allowing retakes, then how much are we valuing their learning? So we really want to give them multiple attempts at mastering that material. And last of all, just keeping in mind that making retakes a part of normal routine, as so many of these practices, is very helpful. So maybe every time you give a unit check or whatever, however you call it, that the next day or that right after they finish it, they're welcome to, to retake something if they had planned. However you want to make those are at teacher discretion. But I tried to make whatever day we did a check be a day that they could also retake from something else, as well as after school. But just figuring that out is important to make it a norm and make it more likely to happen.
And I think it, just like you said, Beth, it goes back to mindset. And if we're trying to build a growth mindset in our students and this idea that the brain is a muscle, if we say that to students, but our actions don't really align to that, kids aren't going to buy into it. If we say your brain is a muscle and it can continue to grow and this whole idea of growth mindset, yeah, you're not there yet, this idea of yet, but then we don't allow retakes and redos, there's a mismatch of what we're saying there. And even as educators, I go through the teacher evaluation system. If at the beginning of the year I'm marked developing and then Mr. Wyatt comes back mid-year and I'm proficient, those scores don't get averaged together. I got the opportunity to re-demonstrate what I've learned as an educational professional. And so even in our profession, we're kind of graded on this mastery system too, where as we learn and implement, then we're allowed to retake and redo. And so I think it's only fair to offer that opportunity for our students as well.
Yeah, and I really like, one thing that always strikes me is sometimes we allow kids to retake, but we almost make them feel bad about it. And we really have to nurture their willingness to take it over and do it again. And somebody said something to me the other day, and I'm going to paraphrase it, but it's essentially, when kids fail, we fail. And we have to really take the ownership of maybe I didn't meet their learning style, or maybe I didn't give them exactly what they needed to be successful. So I really appreciated that what you were just saying. Sorry, bye.
No, you're good. Yeah, so it's I think that was one of my big, when we started talking about grading, I was just like a lot of people, and there was a lot of pushback, and just I didn't understand, and I'd been graded one way. And then I got to work late one day, and my principal said, all right, that's like $20 off. And like, he was joking, but it hit me. And I was like, here I am, a professional. I'm an adult, and I'm doing some of the same things my students are doing. And they're just young adult, like they're immature. I'm going to have to teach them like And I can't hold them to a standard that I'm not going to hold myself to. Like if I'm late, I don't know. It was just this big revelation. I had some amazing administrators in my life. Very lucky to have worked with some of the people I did. But one of the things that some of our teachers, and this is something that Stephanie has shared, is that we do have kids, we have to kind of facilitate that growth mindset. And you have two extremes. You have kids that they don't believe they can. They've learned failure so often, and that's just what they come to expect. And so that idea of growth mindset and that they can do it, you have to really nurture it. And then you have students that rush through something in 5 seconds and then want to retake it today while they're sitting in class with no relearning. And so there has to be this kind of procedures and a structure in place for retakes and redos to help kind of build that culture in the class. And so Rick Wormley does a lot of work around retakes and redos, and these are some of kind of his big ahas. And so thinking about what's reasonable, I know we've all lived the end of the quarter where all the students want to redo everything 2 days before the end of the quarter. And so setting some guidelines around some of those things and setting parameters. He talks about kind of protecting your sanity and doing those at teacher discretions. Work with students to develop a plan. Like I said, I taught middle school. Some of those middle schoolers have a better calendar than I have, but some of those poor babies, they can't come up with a plan like that, like how they're going to retake and redo. And so helping students map out what they really need to do to accomplish that goal. Let them set a goal and help them map it out with specific dates. And then one thing that I think I struggled with when I first started this whole process was I didn't allow for student reflection. And he talks about the importance of having students reflect on why students received the grade they did. Was it, and I think I have some teachers at Carver that have worked with this quite a bit around the student reflection piece each time they take an assessment, and having them reflect on why they think they got the grade they did. Why did you miss certain questions? We have some teachers that have put in quite a bit of work around that aspect, and they've really seen it pay off. Is it you just rush through it? Maybe you had life things going on and you didn't get to study. Maybe it's the way that I taught the curriculum and it didn't really mesh with how you learned best. Did you just get tripped up? Like there's all kinds of reasons why students may not meet mastery, and having them reflect on that is really important to the whole learning process.
Ashley, can I just make one more comment? I'm so sorry.
Yes.
With always at the teacher's discretion, I think it's really important that we realize that it's not a one size fits all. So what's reasonable to one child might not be reasonable to another. And when you throw in poverty or a bad home life or a disability, ADHD or dyslexia or anything like that, I think that as adults in general, not just as teachers, we have to realize that some kids just need a little bit longer, and some kids do need a little bit more of a hand on their back as they go through. So with it being within reason and the teacher decides what's reasonable, I do think it's really important to point out that that's not going to be your whole class gets one. And that goes to your whole platform of personalized learning is that it has to be, has to be personalized to the child, which is very, very difficult. And I know that, and I accept that. But anyway. All right, I have to go to a principal's meeting. Sorry, I won't talk anymore.
Right, it's not a one size fits all, and it's not a once and done. And it does become. It comes down to a lot of it. Beth mentioned learner profiles, and we do a lot of work with some of our personalized learning teachers around relationships and really knowing that kid and knowing what's going on, because there may be a lot that's going on in the background you don't know about. And sometimes we want to place some of these arbitrary rules that we think teach responsibility, and that's what we're trying to do for them. But there's a lot of things going on with some of these kids, and we need to know that so that we can kind of tweak this process and make this educational experience as educational and as valuable for our kids as possible.
Actually, let me just add to that. Canvas has,
go ahead.
Go ahead.
Oh, thanks guys, sorry. So there's just 2 points that I want to raise here. And one is on, as important as reflection is, we also have to remember that along the way, it's just as important to give good, meaningful feedback. Ashley voiced it like right as I said it. She knew exactly where I was going. So feedback is so important. And my analogy with feedback is that that's our students' GPS. It's how they know where they're going along the way and if they've missed a turn, and whether or not, you know, they need that guidance as they're en route to mastery. They need to know how to get there. So our feedback is their guidance to mastery. My second point would be, when we also think about the retakes and redos, we also look at remediation, and the understanding that remediation is greatly different than intervention, because you'll have students that need to be remediated, and then you'll also have students that need intervention. So students that need remediation tend to be missing grade level skills or standards. They have a grade level gap of content that they're currently working on. They can access that content, but they can't master that content. Versus intervention is, I can't even access this content because I have skill gaps from previous years that are keeping me from making those connections. And that is a much different process and work that we need to take versus remediation. And that's all.
That goes back to the idea of MTSS that Beth was alluding to earlier, and having that clear understanding of where students are so we can know differentiation is for our core, but some of those interventions are for those tier 2 and tier 3, and how do we need to proceed? And so that's why that data becomes really important.
Actually, just one really, I mean, for teachers that are in the audience here, one tool that we have this year that we have never had before is in Canvas. And if this would be more of your graded things and not your practice feedback along the way, maybe, but if for a student who has, you can on any assignment, you can go there and go, students who did not turn this in, automatically send a message, or you set the number, students who scored below A, 80%, 70%, and then give them some feedback. And it could be feedback, or this is how you can come, or this is where you can come, this is how you can retake. But that's a really great way for not just letting that kid accept that 60 and moving on, but, you know, communicating to them, you recognize that they got a 60 and that is not okay. And making them come is a different story, but unless you do a whole classic type of setting. Yeah. Just wanted to throw that. Canvas has a great tool there.
One of the things too, especially thinking through the lens of relearning and that accountability feature, is we have some teachers that will do like these retake tickets, which speaks to that idea of developing a plan. What's your plan for relearning some of this content? And so helping students understand how they learn best. Are there study strategies that work really well? Are you going to come to tutoring? Are we going to do something whole class? But it helps them map out this plan for being able to retake. And so some of our teachers, and it also helps with some of that accountability too. Like there has to be relearning. And so once the relearning has happened, then we can retake and reassess and see that growth over time. But those retake tickets are one of the things that some of our teachers, and we have some different examples there. An elementary one that Stephanie's used. Sometimes, depending on the situation, Jessica really framed this in her classroom as, look, your student may not have met mastery, but look at the work they're willing to put in. She used it as almost like a positive parent letter to show parents like the work ethic of their student. Like they didn't meet mastery the first time, but they're going to put in the work. And this is all the things they've done to relearn it. And she really tried to frame it and build that positive culture around it to help them communicate that. But that's another piece and another layer of kind of that accountability, because I know people oftentimes will say, well, if I just let them retake and retake and retake, they're not learning that. Well, some of the responsibility is put on them, as well as pulling them in small groups and planning for that in the classroom as well. But teaching them how to learn and learning themselves as learners is an important part of this process too. So we have other stuff. I'm going to stop there. We have a whole, Stephanie does a ton around data tracking and goal setting to help facilitate the retake process. But I'm going to pause and let people ask questions if you want to stick around and ask questions. I know there's been a ton of great comments and questions in the chat. And if you would like to voice any of those, you can. But we'll also go back through and look at some of those. Tina and I have actually talked about different ways that we can address some of those questions, whether it's through like a FAQ or a podcast or something like that, because some of you are raising some really great reflective questions that we definitely want to dive back into. So we're going to pause there. We're not going to go into the data tracking part of it just because we're so far over. But if anyone has questions, please, 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 please feel free. You can throw it in the chat, or you could unmute yourself and ask, and we would be more than happy to try to answer any of those. And I'll put the link to the attendance one more time for those of you who may not have gotten it, or it may have gotten buried, because I want to make sure that you get to do that.
And Ashley, I think one really important piece that you all taught, you and Brittany, and early on, was for those of us learning, was there's so many things we can work on and always will be to grow, is to not try to, I'm going to work on this, and this, it's not doable. So picking that one thing where you're going to start is helpful for sanity.
Yep. I mean, absolutely. Like, this is, like we said at the beginning, this is a journey and we all continue to learn. I continue to read research and best practice around all of these things. And so as we continue to learn, we adjust, and each group of students we get every year is different. So we continue to adjust some of those practices as well.
Do you know if there are any groups that are available that, like by grade level, you could get together and talk about what you're learning? Because I feel like I do better when I collaborate with other people.
Sweet. So we have a group of personalized learning lead teachers that some of them, this has been their focus, and they're elementary, middle, and high school teachers, but we definitely have some elementary. Are you elementary?
Yes, 4th grade.
We definitely have some elementary school teachers that have embarked on this work in their classroom, and we're getting ready to roll out some different sessions and things like that. So if you'll shoot me an email, okay, I can definitely help you make some of those connections with some of those teachers who have been in this work and have done it at the elementary school level.
Yeah, because one of the things that I feel after I leave this, sitting here and listening to it, it all sounds good, but then I go back to how am I going to implement this, and I'm completely lost.
Yeah. And so having some of those people to ask some of those questions of, I think is really important. So if you'll shoot me an email, I can help connect you with some of those elementary folks that you can kind of pick their brain.
Perfect.
Yep. Anyone else?
I might share one thing I found. I'm teaching 8th grade this year, but no matter what level I've taught, is when I do give kids a playlist, some kids I don't give them the choice because they have shown in the past they just don't have the executive function, or maybe they are the kids who will just opt out of everything when they're given sort of open pathways. So always have a pathway that is already laid out with the high value item, kind of some rote practice for that kid who does need direct instruction. And maybe that's your EC kid, or maybe that's your, I don't know, not motivated kid or whatever. So at least it's a starting place so they can move through some material.
Yeah, I think the way in which you structure, well, the way in which you structure some of those playlists and the way in which you deliver them, you could differentiate that for different kids. Absolutely. Some kids do really well with choice. Some kids struggle with choice. There's a lot of research around choice as well, and it's a valuable tool to use. But the way in which you deliver some of those playlists, you can definitely differentiate based on student needs. And prioritizing some of those activities, like we've seen some teachers do a may do, must do. So you got your must do list in front of you. If you get through those, then you might. But yeah, so there are different ways you can structure those to differentiate and meet the needs of different kids. Mr. Webster, I just want to say, I don't know if you've already logged off, but some of your comments are so insightful. I can't wait to go back through the chat and look at some of them and read them and address them, because you have some really awesome questions. They're very reflective. So shout out to Mr. Webster if he hasn't already logged off. Anybody else? Big questions, things like that. Julie, I bet you have to be signed in. Let me check the setting. And if that is the case, I will change it just for you. All right. All right, Julie, I changed the settings so that you don't have to be signed in to WSFCS. So let me put the link back in the chat, and then that should help. Because sometimes you can restrict it just to WSFCS, but I changed it, so you should be able to access it no matter what now. Cam, thank you for managing the chat today.
Ashley, did you see what I put?
Maybe. There's been a lot in there. What, do you have a question?
Well, sort of. I don't think I properly registered because I did not register through the school Wi-Fi. So I attended today. I filled out the form. So do I just have to wait till I get on school Wi-Fi and do it?
Yep. That is a good question.
And does that backlog me to last week, or do I just get for this week? I will watch your video, I promise.
So the attendance form for this one is this week. We're talking about different ways that maybe we can do some virtual PD using some of those recorded sessions. So there may be a way in the future that we can build like a module. So be on the lookout for that. Tina and I have kind of rolled around that idea as well.
Excelente. Thank you very much, ma'am.
You are welcome. I'm going to stop recording.